of the ironworks the nickname Wildcat pilots gave to Grumman. The nickname is derived from the tough reputation of many of the airplanes produced by the company. For no matter how bad a beating a Grumman airplane took, many of them managed to get their pilots back home alive. Today, out of the more than 7,000 Wildcats produced, barely a dozen remain. Wildcat owner and pilot Steve Craig.
Well, this particular aircraft had been returned from active war status for anti-submarine patrol off the coast of Florida to Glenview Naval Air Station and was being used for advanced pilot transition training and carrier qualifications and gunnery practice.
Navy pilots, or naval aviators as they prefer to be called, would go to the Chicago area base to learn how to land on aircraft carriers. There weren't any aircraft carriers on the Great Lakes at the time, so the Navy had to get a little creative.
The Navy bought 2 lake liners, pleasure boats, and they cleared the whole top off and put a deck on them and made them into carriers.
The 2 lake liners, the USS Wolverine and the USS Sable, were designated only as training carriers, meaning they only had enough room for 1 aircraft to land and take off at a time. Steam catapults found on today's ships also weren't built onto these carriers. To get planes into the air, Mother Nature had to do her part.
Those carriers that were redesigned.
Carrier qualifications were a learning experience for young aviators. As such, there were numerous accidents. Causes ranged from pilot error, adverse weather conditions, or mechanical failure. Although not all of them were lost during carrier qualifications, there were dozens of crashes into the lake. It's been estimated that as many as 200 airplanes are now resting on the bottom, most of which were deposited over a 3-year training cycle during the war. This plane was one of them, taken to maintain historical accuracy. And to the veterans that once flew these planes in the war, it looks like that aspect of the project met its goal.
But this plane is just remarkable. It's actually better now than it was when it flew because it has a better engine, bigger engine, and it has a much better propeller.
Paul Beecham has an interesting history with this particular Wildcat. At Craig's invitation to come see the airplane, Beecham made a surprising discovery.
And it was just by chance that I brought my logbook because I didn't think. When I checked out on carriers, there were probably 100 of these planes at Great Lakes Naval Air Station. And the odds against me flying this particular plane were 100 to 1. So it was really something when we looked at it. You have a landing signal officer there, you touch your wheels down, he gives you the cut, you hit the ground and you give it throttle. You don't hesitate, you just go on up and around. You keep going around and you may shoot 15, 20, 30 landings. Well, it gets awfully boring for the landing signal officer, and they have a lot of different signals they can give you. And there's one signal that signifies land, I want to talk to you about something you're doing. Well, out of the corner of my eye, I'll swear I saw he give me this signal. So the next time around, I get my cut and I land, and instead of just going on and taking off, I taxi forward. We use manifold pressure. And I did this 61 years ago. F4F. And it just looks, and it's amazing. It's amazing.
The Wildcat was largely mechanical. There weren't any hydraulics to help the pilot control the plane. It was all leverage and brute strength, which is exactly what it took to handle the airplane on takeoff. Wildcat pilots also had to be very careful when it was time to land. One needs only to look at the Wildcat head-on to see why. The wingspan of the aircraft is 38 feet, wingtip to wingtip. The span of the 2 main landing wheels is less than 6 feet.
It was wild to control. Great airplane in the air, but once you got on the ground, it was a fight. It was for me anyhow.
While a little wily on the ground, the Wildcat could hold its own in the air. What it didn't have in speed and maneuverability, it more than made up for in durability and protecting the pilot in battle.
The Zeros, if you got a burst in on them, it just blow it completely apart.
We could absorb them in our fuel tanks, and they couldn't. Made a lot of difference. saved a lot of lives.
We'll be right back with Raising the Wildcat. The Wildcat had been flown for almost 10 years before it was sold to Steve Craig in 2002. And the reason he says he was drawn to it is to preserve the little-known stories of those opening days of the war.
Well, from the very beginning, the Wildcat and the pilots and the crews that maintained and flew this airplane in support of the Pacific War is really a remarkable story of sacrifice and heroism. And for example, there were more medals of honor awarded to Wildcat pilots than any other plane in the history of aviation. So it truly is a very special artifact, memorial really.
During the restoration, crews were meticulous in keeping the aircraft just as it appeared in those early days of World War II, as a memorial to the sacrifice of the men who flew this plane into battle. Under the canopy, a special tribute is paid to perhaps one of the greatest known Wildcat pilots of all time, Edward Butch O'Hare.
In his defense of the Lexington, flying a plane identical to this, an F4F-3, when he single-handedly attacked 8 Japanese Betty bombers and shot down 6 of them, was credited for 5.
Paul Beecham, a former pilot of the Wildcat, and its younger brother, the F6F Hellcat, remembers O'Hare's daring mission.
Well, I absolutely heard about Butch O'Hare. Now, at the time that he did this, I was still a cadet at Pensacola. And this was the first big story of the war, so it was really blown up. I mean, it was the first time that we had achieved something against the Japanese. Up until this time, every story was we had been defeated, and so it was a wonderful news release. And I'm not discounting what he did. He did a great job. He shot down 5 planes in about 30 minutes and maybe saved an attack on the fleet, and he certainly deserved all the credit he got.
When Wildcats first began dueling with the Japanese Zero, the pilots found often their heavy F4Fs just couldn't keep up with the enemy aircraft. So they learned to keep the Zero within their realm.
You could turn with the Zero pretty well until you got above, I'd say 7,000 to 8,000 feet, and you started losing power. Zero operated better higher than we did. They could turn quicker than you could, accelerate quicker than you could, but it wouldn't take much of punishment. You put a couple of 50 caliber shells in the fuel tank, and that was it. The fight was over.
A kill or be killed situation, usually dogfighting was over within just a few minutes. A scant sliver of time compared to the uncertainty surrounding these pilots during losing friends is never easy, but as Beecham says, in the air, you're somewhat protected from seeing the actual death of a squadron mate.
In our squadron, we had a squadron of 48. We had 24 pilots shot down. We didn't see anyone get killed. We didn't see them hands blown off, legs blown off, you know, all that sort of stuff. They just didn't come back from the flight. We may see their plane go in the water. We may see it explode in air, but that's still not like seeing somebody, a friend of yours, being riddled with bullets. I'm not saying it was any easier. Well, yes, it was easier. I can't imagine seeing a buddy ripped to shreds by bullets. And it wasn't easy, of course, to lose friends. It hurt terribly because we were a band of brothers. And in times of combat and war like that, you just don't think about it. You've got a job to do, and you do it.
There are many distractions in war, but one that was always on the minds of many pilots was the Golden BB, the infamous term they gave the projectile you never saw coming. However, there was a little protection they could take against the unseen.
Keep your head on the swivel, because you'll never see the one that kills you. And it's true. They kept pounding that into you. Keep looking. Keep that head on a swivel all the time. And it's good advice.
Alan sums up that chapter of his life in these words.
I've always said I wouldn't take $1 million for what the experience I've had, and I wouldn't do it again for $10 million. So that's about as honest as it can be.